For those of you in 4A, I hope you enjoyed presentation 15. For those of you in 2A and 3A, welcome to presentation 16, talking about the War of the Union. I hope you remember a lot of the things we talked about in class today. Bleeding Kansas, popular sovereignty, how the nation was splitting along sectional lines along that Mason-Dixon line between Pennsylvania and Maryland. All right, let's get started talking about the Civil War. As soon as Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated, the Civil War began. No shots were fired until the Battle of Fort Sumter, but the events had been set in motion. We talked about that in class today, about how Fort Sumter was put under siege in December and had been under siege for quite some time. When Lincoln was inaugurated, he promised not to interfere with slavery where it existed and declared the perpetual union of the states. Lincoln appointed many of his closest competitors for the office of president to his cabinet. Salmon Chase, William Seward were appointed to his cabinet. Fort Sumter was a federal fort in South Carolina. When South Carolina seceded, they proclaimed possession of all federal property. Buchanan and later Lincoln would not allow it, and the fort, well, Buchanan kind of did. He didn't do a whole lot to stop it. But Lincoln, the fort was under siege by Confederate forces. They began to run low on supplies, and immediately after. So Lincoln ordered the fort resupplied as soon as after he was inaugurated. And on April 12th, after a Confederate demand to surrender was rebuffed, so the Confederates were demanding them to surrender, and the Union soldiers said no, the battle began. The Confederates fired the first shot on Fort Sumter. A day later, the fort surrendered to Confederate forces. The first shots of the Civil War had been fired and the Confederacy had won. You see this picture below is a picture of Fort Sumter. So on April 15th, 1861, Lincoln issued a, quote, proclamation of war for loyal states to supply 75,000 troops to put down the rebellion. He ordered a blockade of the southern coast. This would later be ruled by the Supreme Court to have the same effect as a declaration of war. So Lincoln helped move the forces into play, and then Congress declared war. Once Lincoln issued the order to have troops enlist, 4 more states seceded: Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Arkansas. Delaware, although a slave state, remained in the Union, and Maryland, also a slave state, was forced to remain by federal troops, primarily because Washington, D.C. is in Maryland. The western portion of Virginia seceded from the state and was admitted to the Union as West Virginia. Missouri and Kentucky remained in the Union as well, even though they were slave states. Robert E. Lee of Virginia was asked to lead the Federal Army against the forces of the Confederacy. He told those who were trying to get him to come to the north, he's told them that he could not go against his country, quote, meaning Virginia. Although Lee failed to see the good of secession, quote, he could not raise my hand against my birthplace, my home, and my children. He refused saying that the state came before a union. Although the majority of Southerners fought for the Confederacy, over 100,000 soldiers who fought for the Union were actually Southerners by birth. Here's a map of the states that seceded. All of the states that are in the light green are states that had voted for John Breckinridge. Those states that are in the purple are actually ones who voted for John Bell. So it's interesting to see that those are the states that, actually North Carolina didn't, but it took a lot more for some of the states to secede than others. The ones in the deep south seceded very quickly and left the Union quickly, whereas the others took a little bit more convincing. The North easily bettered the South when it came to manufacturing, and that shouldn't surprise anybody. The South was still overwhelmingly agrarian, which made it difficult to supply their war effort. The North outnumbered the South in total population by almost 5 to 1. Now, that put them at a very distinct advantage. At the beginning of the war, the Confederacy fought a defensive war, which would call for less supplies and soldiers, and this benefited their cause greatly. This picture was taken at the Battle of Bull Run, which is the first official battle of the Civil War. It doesn't really look like a battle, does it? A lot of people came to this battle because it was right outside of Washington, D.C., and they were caught up in the excitement of the military preparation. Both sides predicted very quick victory. Nowhere was this naive optimism more clearly displayed than at the First Battle of Bull Run, or the Battle of Manassas. Both sides named the battles after different things. The Union named them after natural features, and the Confederacy usually named them after towns. So the Battle of Bull Run was the North's title, and Manassas was the South's. Anyway, with assumptions of victory, the rebels and the Yankees recently stumbled into an entangling web of horror at the Battle of Bull Run. The mood was so breezy, in fact, that hundreds of civilians had ridden out from Washington to picnic and watch the entertaining spectacle of what they thought would be a one-battle war. Instead, they watched a chaotic defeat. Let's see. At the Battle of Bull Run, the Federal forces were defeated, but the exhausted Confederates did not give chase. This battle proved that the lie of conventional wisdom that the wars would be over in one decisive victory for either side. The Battle of Bull Run was supposed to be that one quick battle, and it wasn't. After Bull Run, Lincoln adopted a strategy to launch a three-pronged assault on the South, dividing it into sections. It called for the Union Army of the Potomac to defend Washington, D.C., and exert constant pressure on the Confederate capital of Richmond. At the same time, the Navy would blockade the southern coast and dry up the Confederacy's access to foreign goods and weapons. So we've got come down from Washington, D.C., all along the coast. The final component of the plan would be to divide the Confederacy by sending Navy gunboats and transports to invade the South along the main water routes, the Mississippi, the Tennessee, and the Cumberland rivers. The Confederate strategy was a little bit simpler. If the Union forces could be stalemated, Jefferson Davis, who was the president, and others hoped that the British or the French might be persuaded to join their cause, or perhaps public sentiment in the North would force Lincoln to seek a negotiated settlement. A little bit like President Washington's philosophy during the Revolutionary War. So now we get into some of the tactics and the military advancements in technology that were used during the war. To break the Union blockade of the South so that it might be resupplied, the South created the first ironclad naval ship called the Merrimac. And that's what it was called for the Union, but they captured it and they called it the Virginian. They captured the Union frigate. It had iron bars bolted to the hull, which made the ship more heavily armored than anything the Union had afloat. After defeating several Union ships, it met its match when the Monitor arrived, a new ironclad that battled to a draw. The Confederate ironclad returned to its port, which was soon captured, and she was scuttled to prevent capture. From this point on, after they had lost their ironclad ship, the majority of naval victories were obtained by the Union. Excuse me. The Federal Congress would at first rely on recruits to field the armies. The Confederacy would also rely on recruits, but by 1862 it started an involuntary draft. In 1863, the Union followed suit, so first war that we had used a draft on both sides. Foreign recognition was vital to Confederate interests if they hoped to survive. Much like the rebellious colonies had courted France a century before, the rebels also hoped to secure French recognition. France agreed as long as Great Britain would follow suit. But under pressure from the United States, Great Britain wouldn't join suit. While the North and South warred, the West was rapidly being populated. During the war, Idaho, Nevada, Arizona, and Montana were added to the Union as territories. These new areas would require federal troops for protection and would draw men and supplies from the war effort back east. There was even a small battle at Picacho Peak just south of Phoenix. A few shots were fired there during the Civil War, so Arizona actually saw a little bit of action during the war. The theaters of the Civil War are divided into two categories, east and west of the Appalachian Mountains. In the Western Theater, Confederate General Albert S. Johnson was defeated by General Ulysses S. Grant when Grant took Forts Henry and Donelson in February of 1862. This is a map of his attacks in West Tennessee. The Battle of Shiloh, which is Hebrew for place of peace, ironically, in Tennessee had over 20,000 casualties. And the term casualties means killed, wounded, or captured, not just those who were killed. So 20,000 were taken out of commission at the Battle of Shiloh. After the debacle of Bull Run, Lincoln replaced commanding General McDowell with General George McClellan. McClellan proved to be an excellent organizer and strategist, but horrible at implementation. He was confident, but he was cautious, and his caution proved to be crippling. He planned an amphibious landing on the peninsula of Virginia, exactly where Cornwallis had been defeated in the Revolution, ironically, and marched west to the Confederate capital of Richmond. He dawdled there until March of 1862. After he landed, he got within 60 miles of his goal before stalling out. He just stopped. Before he got to Richmond, he just stopped. And nobody understands exactly why he did that. Robert E. Lee took command of the rebel forces and defended the capital. So they fought him back, and McClellan had no victory there for the Union when he really should have. Lee attacked the Union forces before General Halleck and his troops could arrive, once again in the vicinity of the Bull Run River and the town of Manassas. This is the second Battle of Bull Run. The Confederate victory was so great that the Union Army was driven all the way back to Washington, D.C., where Lincoln had no choice but to reinstate McClellan as the leader. So he'd put Halleck in. Halleck didn't work. He put McClellan back in again. Instead of staying on the defensive, the victorious Lee changed the format of the war by invading the Union. Lee's plan was to win a momentous victory in the Union and thus secure foreign recognition. The strategy was discovered when a package of cigars wrapped with his orders were found by Union soldiers. McClellan, who did not immediately act on this intelligence, can be held responsible for losing that battle. Finally, McClellan engaged Lee at Antietam Creek, near the town of Sharpsburg, Maryland. The result was the bloodiest day of the war. The Union soldiers outnumbered the Confederates 2-1, and the Union forces claimed a victory by forcing Lee to retreat back into the Confederacy. There were, with an estimated 3,650 soldiers were killed, over 17,000 were wounded, 1,700 captured or missing, for a total of 22,720 casualties in one day of the war. Can you imagine that? Think about how many people 22,700 is. And they were all killed, missing, or captured by the end of the day. Because it was not the stunning defeat that Lincoln wanted, he permanently reassigned McClellan to recruiting duty. So McClellan was demoted from that point on, and it did not sit well with General McClellan, as you'll see in a few minutes. Matthew Brady was the first photographer of war, and he took a lot of pictures of the Civil War. We have images that have been preserved because of him, and this is a picture from the Battle of Antietam. General Lee said, "It is well that war is so terrible, we should grow too fond of it." For those who see war up close and personal, it's a very different experience than those who just hear about it. So I think about this image and how many people were actually killed that day at Antietam. Antietam proved to be the turning point of the war. The Union, which had yet to experience a great victory, claimed one at Antietam. Lincoln, who had been waiting for such an event, then issued the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing all of the slaves in the Confederate part of the South. We're going to talk about the Emancipation Proclamation in class, either on Wednesday or if not on Monday. So this is the campaign. This is the campaign that they were doing up in the North with Antietam and how the Union, they kept just going around in circles. And the idea was that the South was trying to prevent the Union from getting into Richmond. And they would try everything they could to try to get down there a little bit farther south. McClellan's replacement was Ambrose Burnside, and he may have been Lincoln's worst choice of all. With Lee's men entrenched on the high ground, Burnside sent Union troops 6 times into what the Union general called a great slaughter pen, and that was 12,000 casualties at the Battle of Fredericksburg. So again and again and again, he kept sending them. But you ever heard the term that whoever holds the high ground wins? Lee had the high ground, and it was impossible to get him down from that. Lincoln had insisted that the perfect purpose of the conflict was to restore the Union, and that he did not have the authority to free the slaves. Yet the expanding war forced the issue. Fugitive slaves had begun to turn up in Union army camps, and generals did not know whether to declare them free or not. And although Lincoln had promised to protect slavery where it existed in his inauguration address, once slave lands were taken by federal soldiers, the chief issue became what to do with the slaves who had been captured. So in one bold move, Lincoln was able to turn the war into a war of liberation for the slaves, so that foreign recognition, France and England wouldn't come in on the side of the South, and to encourage those enslaved to the Confederacy to not be as willing to help their masters. The Emancipation Proclamation did not extend to any Confederate lands at the time were held by Union forces. Still, many slaves in those areas proclaimed their freedom anyway. The great abolitionist leader Frederick Douglass was overjoyed at Lincoln's actions. This is a painting and drawings of what it looked like on either side of the aisle. So this, on the one on the left, is the one that depiction of the North, and how nerve-wracking and horrible that must have been for Lincoln to make this decision that he needed to liberate the slaves, and how much time and effort it must have taken him, and how exhausting it must have been. But if you look at the image from the South's response to that is he's got his foot on the Bible. It wasn't that big of a deal. You can see the devil is holding that bowl, saying that the devil was on Lincoln's side to get the slaves emancipated. Blacks in the North would be organized into all black military units at this point, and they would be led by white officers. By doing so, the war continued to change from one to preserve the Union to a war of liberation for the millions of enslaved in the South. By the end of the Civil War, 10% of all enlisted men were African American. This is a photograph of an all-black unit who fought during the Civil War. In addition, when Grant was fighting on the Western Front, those liberated slaves who ran away from their masters would be employed by the military to grow food, to help build trenches, that kind of stuff. So Grant used them for different ways as well, but Lincoln actually enlisted them at this point. In the North, over 20,000 women served as nurses or other health-related volunteers during the war. On both sides, the departure of so many men required women to enter traditionally male-dominated spheres. Clara Barton, who's pictured right here, who oversaw the distribution of medical supplies to Union troops, founded what was later known as, and is today known as, the Red Cross. Each side of the Civil War believed it was fighting a holy war to ensure God's favor. Each side provided chaplains and for the soldiers, and many camps held their own religious revivals. Of course, as the war continued, it became evident that God would not bring victory to both sides. 17-year-old Emma LeConte of South Carolina became extremely upset toward the end of the war as the Union began taking the upper hand. They say right always triumphs, but what cause could have been more just than ours? An editor of a Southern Presbyterian newspaper explained that God chastens only those he loves. Lincoln, on the other hand, was never really sure which side God was on. He explained, both may be, and one must be wrong. So he's saying both sides might be wrong, but one's got to be wrong. He went on to say, quote, God cannot be for or against the same thing at the same time, yet the contest proceeds. They continued to search for God's hand in the war and who was going to win, and they never came to a very strong conclusion. In order to finance the war, the Union taxed, borrowed, and printed more money, which caused a lot of problems after the war. Congress passed the first ever income tax in 1862, which was widely thought to be unconstitutional. That will be changed when they passed a constitutional amendment about an income tax. The Confederacy instituted a tax on property, but relied on the individual states to collect it. By 1863, the government placed taxes on everything. They printed money but had no control over it, and inflation was drastic. By 1864, prices were so outrageous that in the South, a turkey sold for $100, and bacon was $10 a pound. So I don't think I'd want to be in the South. With the majority of the Democrats having left Congress, Lincoln found himself battling a group of radical Republicans who argued for major changes to the South and designed to punish them for their actions. What Democrats remained pursued a policy of returning the Union to its pre-war status. Republicans favored punishment. Union Democrats favored reprieve. Awesome. There's my phone. And I don't even care who it is. Okay. In 1864, the Democrats nominated General McClellan for president. Lincoln secured the Republican nomination for another term, and he chose Andrew Johnson, who was a Democrat from Tennessee, who he had refused to relinquish his seat in the Senate when Tennessee seceded, and they chose him to be the vice president, hoping to bridge this gap from North and South. The election looked bad for Lincoln until victories by Admiral David Farragut and William Tecumseh Sherman turned the tide of the war. Somebody else is going to have to answer that phone. I hope they answer it downstairs. Lincoln was reelected by a landslide at this point. In the Confederacy, the executive branch enjoyed a 6-year term. This is awesome because nobody downstairs is going to answer the phone and there's nothing I can do about it. So let's see if it rings one more time. Nope, somebody got it. Okay. In the Confederacy, the executive branch enjoyed a 6-year term, so neither Davis nor Vice President Alexander Stevenson had to run again during the course of the war. Davis's biggest challenge came from those arch secessionists who, once their state had left the Union, refused to support the new Confederate government. They just said they weren't part of any government. They had seceded, they weren't going to work together in any way, and they were going to be on their own. So they had a lot of problems with that Confederate government. Following General Burnside's removal after that horrible loss at Fredericksburg, General Joseph Hooker was placed in command. Lee engaged Hooker's forces at Chancellorsville, Virginia, and defeated them, even though Lee was vastly outnumbered. Lee had this mystic aura around him that he was undefeatable, and the North thought that as well as the South. At this battle, Lee's most dedicated and trusted general, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, was accidentally shot by his own men. Upon his death, Lee mourned, "I have lost my right arm, my most reliable general." So that was the last big Confederate victory, which was at Chancellorsville in May. In the Western Theater, USS Grant was trying to secure the city of Vicksburg, which occupied a strategic bend in the Mississippi River. By capturing it, he would cut the South in half. Whoever controlled Vicksburg controlled the river. He launched a daring overland campaign against the city and placed it under siege. In an attempt to pull forces from Vicksburg and to turn Northern support against the war, Lee then invaded Pennsylvania. A Confederate foraging party entered into a little town to search for shoes and accidentally encountered units of Union cavalry on June 30th, 1863. The main forces then quickly converged there. The name of that city was Gettysburg. Trying to take the high ground from the Yankees, Lee ordered General Pickett to lead a charge across a vast quantity of open terrain. Pickett's troops were easily cut off. A document in your document booklet will discuss Pickett's last charge. We'll talk about that on Monday. but within an hour, all 31 of Pickett's men lay dead, dying, or wounded. It was a bloodbath, and most of Gettysburg turned out that way. On July 4th, a day after Gettysburg, the Confederate stronghold at Vicksburg surrendered to Grant's army after a 47-day siege. So back to back, we had the victories in Vicksburg and Gettysburg on basically the same day, so the news came to Washington at about the same time. Lee withdrew from the North, never to invade it again. At the dedication of a national cemetery at Gettysburg, Lincoln delivered one of his shortest and arguably his greatest speech ever, which is the Gettysburg Address. We'll be discussing that in the document booklet too. At the Battle of Chattanooga, the third great Union victory came along, and Lincoln found his general. Chattanooga was won by Ulysses S. Grant. Grant turned a near rout into a stunning victory for the Yankees when he took command of the army from General Rosecrans. Lincoln promoted Grant to lieutenant general and then general-in-chief of all the forces. It took him a long time. So look at that. They'd already been at war since April of 1861. So a little over almost 2.5 years before General Grant was put in charge. Here's a picture from Matthew Brady from Gettysburg. I don't think it's possible for us to understand the scope of death from this battle, how many bodies were all across the ground. If you've ever been to Gettysburg, it's just this big open field, couple of hills, very easy for those on the high ground to shoot those who are on the ground down below. When Grant left the Western Theater, he turned control of those forces over to William Tecumseh Sherman. He was known as, and this is known as Sherman's March to the Sea. Sherman marched southeast from Tennessee towards Atlanta, Georgia, destroying everything in his way. He destroyed crops, farms, towns, roads, and any supplies that the military could use. He and Ulysses S. Grant shared the same philosophy of battle, which was unconditional surrender. We need to find a way to make the South not be able to rebuild itself and come back to war against us again. The Confederate forces were unable to defeat Sherman, and Davis replaced generals in an effort to find someone who could stop him, but nobody ever could. Tightly strung, they were giving a description of Sherman now. Tightly strung, highly profane, and plagued by fits of depression, Sherman was one of the few generals to appreciate the concept of total war. He wanted to destroy Confederate morale as well as the Confederate armies. It wasn't just the army. It wasn't just the soldiers. It was all of the people. His intent was to destroy the South and its ability to wage war by attacking the people and devastating their farms and crops. And that's basically what he did. He burned it to the ground. While Confederate forces made their last stands, Abraham Lincoln prepared for a second term as president. He was the first president since Andrew Jackson to have been elected to a second term, which is kind of shocking. Using the Union's superiority in both manpower and war material, Grant ordered his commanders to wage total war, just like Sherman, to constantly attack Lee's forces and wear them down by attrition, and gradually just wear them down to nothing. Grant had 115,000 soldiers, and Lee had 65,000 at this point. At the Battle of the Wilderness outside Chancellorsville, Grant engaged Lee's forces and continued to attack heavily. Grant's men suffered heavier casualties than Lee's, but the Confederates were running out of replacements, and the North could just tighten up the draft and say, we need more people. Ultimately, Lee retreated to Petersburg, where Grant placed the rebel forces under siege. Fleeing Petersburg in the spring of 1865, Lee tried to escape Grant's pursuing forces. Lee found himself cut off from escape and had no choice but to surrender to Grant. So once he's been fleeing and running, and he's just running around the country trying to stay away from him, and he just really couldn't for very much longer. Let's see. Where's the... Lincoln's philosophy at this time is he wanted to find a way to have a reconciliation between the North and the South. And he didn't want to punish them for coming back in. He wanted them to be fully defeated, but he didn't want to punish them so bad that they couldn't rebuild. He pursued an idea of that reconciliation must be pursued with malice towards none, with charity for all. These 8 words marvelously captured Lincoln's hopes for a restored Union. Redemption was his goal. Victory was less important to him than peace. However, Lee found himself trying to escape Grant and trying to avoid the end of this dream of the South seceding. Lee found himself cut off from escape and had no choice but to surrender to Grant. On April 9th, 1865, Lee donned a dress uniform and met the mud-spattered Grant in the parlor of Wilmer McLean's home at Appomattox Courthouse to tender his surrender. After at Lee's request, Grant let Lee's army keep their sidearms, their horses, and mules, which was unusual for a time of war. They usually took away anything that they could to prevent them from coming to war again. During the surrender, the Union general Joshua Chamberlain ordered his men to salute their enemies as they passed. The Confederates saluted back. General Chamberlain described how still the surrender ceremony was. No trumpets, no drums, no cheers or jeers, simply an odd stillness, as if it was a passing of the dead. April 9th, 1865, and the Civil War was finally over. On April 18th, General William Sherman received Johnson's surrender in Savannah, it wasn't in Savannah. Where was it? It was actually in Charleston that he got his surrender. It was 4 days after the assassination of President Lincoln that he received that surrender. The Civil War was in many respects the first modern war. It was the first modern war in scope. Its scope was unprecedented on how many people were killed. Over 630,000 men died in the conflict from wounds or disease. 50% more than died in all of World War II from the United States. Of the survivors, 50,000 returned home with one or more limbs amputated. Disease, however, was the greatest threat to soldiers, killing twice as many as were lost in battle. And Robert E. Lee said this: after 4 years of arduous service marked by unsurpassed courage and fortitude, the Army of Northern Virginia has been compelled to yield to overwhelming numbers and resources. Here are portraits of the two men who ended the Civil War. Notice the difference in their appearance and in their bearing. Lee held himself very seriously, very formally, whereas Grant is leaning against a tree. This photo of Grant was actually taken after he had lost at Cold Harbor, which was one of his worst losses, and he vowed that he would never lose that bat again. These two photos articulate much of the stories of these two men who led their troops through the most divisive, deadly, and difficult time in America's history. I would say probably the most deadly before, or have never had anything like it since. So Abraham Lincoln wrote this. He said, one side would make war rather than let the nation survive. The other would accept war rather than let it perish. How does this quote summarize the struggle between the North and the South from Lincoln's perspective? Which is the side that made war, and which was the side that accepted war? I want you to give 3 examples from each side that illustrate his thoughts. So give me an example of, if you choose the North made war and the South accepted it, give me 3 examples from each of those. If you choose that the South made war and the North accepted it, then give me 3 examples of that. Include some dates, people, places into your thinking. In class, I will check notes from presentation 15 and presentation 16. This assignment will be discussed in class. Be prepared to back your ideas with evidence. I hope that your understanding of the Civil War, basically the battles and everything, the overriding scope of it is a little bit more understanding. I know that this is a long presentation. We will discuss it even more in class, in depth, and I will see you on Wednesday.